It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. So tonight we have Henry Vinson, and he's the author of Confessions of a DC Madam. And I'm going to have the link up on the, you can go to the Opperman Report blog, you can click on the link, you can purchase the book off of Amazon. But he has his own blog too called blog.confessionsofdcmadam.com. And also too, I think you can get a hold of the book too on the franklinscandal.com website as well. We had Nick Bryan on recently, and we're kind of going to flesh out the Nick Bryan story because this is the actual DC Madam. That's who Henry Vinson is. A fascinating guy. He's had a long career doing a lot of stuff. He was a funeral something with a funeral, and then a pilot and stuff like that. Anyway, Henry, you're there, right?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, give us a little idea of your background. I know you've been in a lot of different kind of businesses and stuff. Let's hear about that.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I really am a fan of your show.
Oh, thank you.
I've gone to mortuary school at Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science. I've got, and after all this happened, I returned to college and earned a master's degree in integrated marketing communications. I'm a commercially rated pilot in airplanes and helicopters and a flight instructor. So I do many, many things, and I've done quite a few things in my life.
So, but right now you work as a pilot and an author.
Right now I work as a consultant. I do a lot of integrated marketing communications and advertising.
Okay.
So I do a lot of consulting.
Okay, very good. I guess we're about the same age, right? Because I'm 52 years old, right?
Well, I'm a little bit older. I'm 55.
Okay. Yeah, it's about the same. Well, give us an idea now. The book is about the Confessions of a DC Madam, and that's because back, I guess, in the 80s, you were running this big deal, what do you call it, escort service in DC, right?
That's right. I was running an escort service, and both Deborah Jean Palfrey and I were dubbed the DC Madam by the press. I ran the largest gay escort service that's ever been exposed in Washington, D.C., and my ultimate downfall was precipitated by the fact that I provided escorts to a CIA asset named Craig Spence. He used my escorts to blackmail politicians and other power brokers, and ultimately I became the fall guy for a sprawling conspiracy whose cover-up was engineered at the pinnacle of the Bush 1 administration.
Now, was this that same? I know that there was a point in time when Barney Frank, he got caught. He had someone was living with him. His boyfriend was living with him. That was part of a gay escort service. Was this part of that same kind of group?
This was during the same time and the same group. Stephen Golby was the one that was living with Barney Frank.
Okay, so now you guys were in the same business. Did you know each other?
Oh, sure. I did know Steve Golby, and Barney Frank was a client of mine. I knew Barney quite well. So, yes.
Well, now that's interesting because now Barney Frank, I think he just recently retired, but he was he pretty much maintained his career for a long time. Now, do you think that he was a subject of this blackmail?
I think that blackmail plays an integral role in American political process, but blackmailers and their blackmail targets would never divulge such misconduct for the obvious reasons. Blackmailers would be subjected to criminal prosecution, and their blackmail targets would be subjected to either prosecution or persecution for the conduct that led them to be blackmailed in the first place. So political blackmail is almost never made public until years after the fact. So I think it's much more prevalent than what many people think.
Yeah, I get that impression as well. Now, you were also the victim of blackmail or extortion in a way by this guy, Craig Price, right?
That's right, Craig Spence.
Craig Spence, sorry.
Yes. Craig Spence was a D.C. power broker and a CIA asset whose upscale D.C. home was bugged for audiovisual blackmail. He even arranged midnight tours of the White House for some of the escorts who I employed. So Spence was always pressuring me to provide him with children, which I refused. And I decided to stop dealing with Craig altogether. And at that point, he sent one of his people over named Tony and two of his thugs, and they paid me a late night visit. They discharged guns outside my window, busted up my apartment, threatened to kill me if I didn't continue to provide escorts to Spence. So although I did continue to provide escorts with Spence, he never again requested that I provide him with children after that.
Now, when you say that these gay escorts were taking tours of the White House, is that the story that would have made the newspapers?
It did make the newspaper. It made the Washington Times.
Right.
But it never made anywhere else.
So, right, I remember seeing that story, and you can still look it up. You can find that news headline if you look in Google Images. Now, those were your clients then. Those are your employees.
That's right. Those were my employees, and that was with Craig Spence, and he arranged this late-night tour of the White House. But it was never made public, only one newspaper, and then quickly the Washington Post got on and changed the story altogether, so it sort of went away.
Okay, now, Nick was telling me part of the story, and basically, Craig Spence pulled you into his office, and he played videotapes for you, how you were recorded.
That's right. Craig, I've been to Craig's house many, many times. In this one particular instance, he asked me to come over, and he had another individual there named Larry King. It's Lawrence King. It's
right.
Not the Larry King with the radio and TV. So they wanted to talk to me. They were asking me about my background. They were talking about the escort service, about the various clients, just general conversation. I was sort of impressed because I thought Craig was really interested in me and was a true friend at that point. After we had talked for a while and had this conversation, Craig got up, walked over to what appeared to be a closet. And then inside the closet was another door, which led into a room that was filled with electronic equipment, TVs. It looked like a TV studio, I suppose. And Craig played back what I had just said. So then I realized very quickly he had cameras all over his house. He had two-way mirrors. His house was built for blackmail. He intended to record and hear everything that went on in his house. And he would have these lavish parties and this party would look like a who's who of Hollywood and Washington, D.C. Everybody would be there. That was anybody. So it was obvious what he was doing at that point.
You know, it's interesting that this guy would be recording his own criminal activity with no fear whatsoever that anything would ever happen to him.
Well, this was a man who had an entourage of protection. He had Secret Service officers who provided him protection. He moved in circles involving the Bush administration in Bush's cabinet. So I don't think he had any fear of anything happening to him. I think he had a lot of connections with people in high places.
Yeah, especially if they're discharging guns in front of your house, they're not concerned about attracting attention and or anything coming back against them. Now, these Secret Service agents that he had around him, were they off duty, on duty? What was the deal with that?
They were off duty. Craig liked to be he was very important, and he made a real presence when he was somewhere because he was surrounded by a huge security detail. And in later years, after he moved out of his first house and moved into a different place, he actually had two condominium units, and one was strictly for his security detail. So he loved to have military officers and Secret Service officers act as his security detail. So he was surrounded by lots of security at all times. Anytime you went to his house, there would be security at the door. It was not unlike seeing, I guess, the vice president or the president, I would imagine.
Fascinating. Okay, now you attended some of these parties as well then, right?
Yes. Craig invited me to several of his parties, and it was interesting because everything was there. Craig had drugs, the most beautiful people, and that's where I first came to know Craig so well. It's because he would spend $20,000 a month with me in escorts. So I would provide him with a lot of people on a daily basis. But when he had parties, he really wanted the most beautiful people he could find. And that was his way that's the way he operated. So he would have beautiful escorts there, and he would put these lawmakers and government officials and media people even in compromising positions, and then he would record them.
Now, can you give me some names of these famous people and celebrities and journalists and politicians?
Well, sure, and I'm comfortable naming names now because I ran an escort service when the Reagan and Bush 1 administration were in office, and the best known client that I had was William Casey because he was the head of the CIA. But I also provided escorts to prominent congressmen like Larry Craig, Barney Frank, Donald Gregg, Vice President Bush's national security advisor. Charles Dutcher was a big client. He was the director of personnel during the Reagan administration. And Paul Ballack was a client and also a very close friend of mine who was a political personnel liaison to Elizabeth Dole.
Amazing. Now Casey was gay or bisexual?
I don't know that he was gay, but he was, but he did like young men.
Wow.
And he came to my attention because he had a rather unusual. The escorts would come back and tell me often about some of the clients. And I didn't even realize it was William Casey initially, but after a few people, I did realize who it was when one of them recognized him. And we provided escorts to, he liked rather to be anointed with oil in a ritualistic way, and he had an erectile dysfunction, so the escorts found him rather perplexing, but so he always made an impression.
That's fascinating. Okay, now you're saying in a ritualistic way. Do you mean like a kind of like a religiously ritual, or was it like a?
He loved to be rubbed down in oil, and he would always say, "Be sure you get all the crevices," and just like that.
Okay, but you must have some great stories, man. It's like I would just love to hear all the gossip from the guys. Just coming back. That would be good enough.
Well, it was interesting.
Yeah, I guess we'd have to change it to an X-rated show, though. We got into too much detail. Okay. Now, how did I guess you were living a pretty good life. You had $20,000 a month coming in from one guy, 26 years old. Okay, now that's a good life. You're rubbing shoulders with the rich and powerful. What happened?
Well, I didn't even. I'm from a small town in West Virginia, and I didn't even realize who a lot of these people were.
Gotcha.
I wasn't into politics at all, and I was working as a funeral director at W.W. Chambers Company in Washington, D.C., and I got into this business by accident. I didn't even know what an escort was when I first went to D.C., but life was very good. It was very busy, and I ran a very successful business for a number of years.
And then how did it all fall apart? What happened?
It all fell apart. Craig Spence, once again, called me over to his house, and this time he had a cabinet member from the Bush administration. And there had been an inquiry from the government accounting office about the use of a credit card.
Right.
And I simply told the government accounting office, well, I think it's a very personal nature, and I think you should discuss it with the card holder. And that was that. So then I was called over to Craig's, and he had a cabinet member there, and they wanted me to submit reports that I was doing blood studies, that it was research that was being done. And I was a funeral director, so I didn't feel comfortable with that. I thought I was being set up, and I was going to be used as a scapegoat. And I said, you are this is your people. You run this place. Why do you need me to do it? I'm nobody. And he said, I can withstand a background investigation. Can you? And that's the way it left. And 48 hours later or less, there was a search warrant served on my house and my mother's and some other locations simultaneously in multiple states. And that started it all in February of 1989.
Right. Like, because now you were running some kind of funeral business as well, right?
That's right. I worked at Chambers Funeral Home in Washington, D.C. They had several locations in that area.
Okay. Now you were running the credit cards through the funeral business. So that was showing up on people's credit card bills that they were $20,000 a month, a funeral. That's going to raise suspicion. Why? Come on, man. You're a smart guy. Why did you do that? Why didn't you just set up another corporation with another credit card account?
Well, it wasn't actually like that. The person who did the credit card transactions was Robert Chambers. He was part of the Chambers family. So he set up a company called Professional Services.
Okay.
But it showed up as a funeral service organization. And that's the government accounting office. That was their question.
Yeah.
How can funeral service be a recurring charge?
Yeah, that was a big mistake, my friend. Otherwise, who knows? So now somehow you wound up with Greta Van Susteren as your attorney.
That's right. And I was very disappointed with the way Greta Van Susteren represented me.
Right.
Because the government accomplishes two objectives when she was my attorney, my silence and my imprisonment. Now, at the onset of my case, she filed an 11-page motion to mandate the release of my clientele list. And she said that the name should be released because if the government's assertion was accurate, and my escort service was, in actuality, a prostitution ring, my clients aided and abetted a criminal enterprise. And she said she felt that forcing the government to disclose my clientele would abate its zealous prosecution of me. But the U.S. attorney for D.C. vehemently contested Greta's motion with a rather disingenuous argument. His argument was that it would be embarrassing for that information to come out. And the judge sided with the U.S. attorney and barred the release of that information. So Greta soon started to change her tune, and she urged me to take a government's plea agreement, which was 5 years in federal prison. And ultimately, I entered into an agreement with the government, and I spent days being debriefed by government officials. I told them everything I knew, everything I'd witnessed, which was very incriminating. And Greta, unbelievably, didn't attend the debriefings when I was incriminating myself. So that was my experience with Greta.
Well, let me ask you this. When she was suggesting to you that she should file this motion to get this list of clients, did you think that would benefit your case?
Well, I thought it would because all of the people who were in the Bush administration, who were in these offices, it would come out.
Yeah.
So I looked at this as a membership dating service more than anything else. And I thought that it would be good if the clients, because if I was doing something wrong, they would be doing something wrong by calling me. But of course, that was not the case. And the names were never released and they were sealed. And in fact, the government still has scores of documents sealed 25 years after the fact.
Wow. Now, when you were going to these meetings with the cops, and I guess it was like a free talk. They told you it was a free talk. You could go in there and tell them whatever you want, and they weren't going to use it against you, right?
That's right.
Okay. But weren't you nervous in there without a lawyer?
Well, I had, again, I'm from a small town in southern West Virginia, a very, very small town, and I was very naive about many things. I just didn't understand what was really going on.
I got you. Now, who was on the other side? How many? Now, when you're in there with this free talk with the DA and stuff like that, who was on the other side of the table opposing you? How many people did they have there?
Probably 10 or 12.
Yeah, see, I know it. Okay. Let me ask you a question. Did they do this kind of thing with you where they pulled out a tape recorder and said, oh, we can't get this thing to work? Oh, darn. Okay, we'll put it over here.
They did not record it at all.
Okay.
It was all handwritten notes.
Okay. Very interesting. But there was now when you went in there and you saw there was 10 guys on the other side, at that point, did you think, hey, maybe this is a mistake?
Greta told me that that's what I needed to do.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. All right.
And of course, I ended up with Greta as an attorney because a reporter at the Washington Post suggested that I hire Greta Van Susteren. That's the way I ended up with Greta Van Susteren.
So she was pretty politically connected back in those days then, and in D.C.
Well, I don't know that, but I know I ended up with her because a reporter at the Washington Post suggested that I get her, and that's the way I ended up with Greta.
Okay, but the Washington Post turns out to be was never any friend of yours whatsoever.
No.
Right.
The Washington, and before I answer that, I want to say I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm rather someone fate placed in the epicenter of a sprawling conspiracy.
Gotcha.
And over the years, I've tried to understand the motivation of the Washington Post to cover up a conspiracy that undermined American democracy. But this answer is fairly complex. But the blackmail enterprise that installed numerous Washington, D.C. power brokers was run by CIA asset Craig Spence. And the CIA and Washington Post, they have a long history of working together. In fact, shortly after the CIA was formed in 1948, the agency initiated Operation Mockingbird, which was its campaign to influence the media. And the CIA tapped the Washington Post publisher Philip Graham to be the CIA's point man to help it infiltrate the media. And Graham stocked the Washington Post with writers and editors who had intelligence backgrounds. And Ben Bradley, the Washington Post executive editor, when the paper was covering up Spence's CIA connection and blackmail activities, he had a long-standing tie to the CIA.
Well, can you describe that? Give us an idea, because I asked Nick about this, and we didn't really get into too much detail. What specifically was his CIA connections?
Well, in the book Catherine the Great, journalist Deborah Davis showed that Ben Bradley was producing CIA propaganda as far back as the 1950s.
Yeah.
And Bradley said that Davis was lying about and pressured her publisher, Harcourt Brace, to withdraw the book publication, and it was withdrawn. Davis then sent several Freedom of Information Act requests to the government. State Department documents confirmed that Bradley churned out CIA propaganda at the behest of the Paris CIA chief. So ultimately, Bradley was the one lying about his CIA connection.
Yeah, that's Bradley. But what about Spence, though? What was his connections? Is anything documented that we know for a fact?
Well, Spence's connection is to the CIA.
Yeah.
And that's well known. The Washington Post or the Washington Times has studied that, and they've confirmed that. And Spence said that he had the CIA connections.
Okay, and Spence wound up, what happened to, how did he wind up?
Well, Spence ended up dead,
right.
Apparently of suicide.
And what do you think? Do you think that was a real suicide? Do you think he was murdered? Think he could still be alive and they swapped out a body or whatever?
Well,
what do you think?
I just don't know that. I just don't know.
Gotcha.
I don't want to speculate on that. I just don't know.
Okay. Oh boy. Okay. So now, okay, they pretty much they got you. They gave you 5 years. That's just for running the escort service.
That's right. 63 months in federal prison. I was hammered with a 43-count RICO indictment, and I was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison.
Now that's a pretty stiff sentence for a first offense on basically what were they contributing prostitution, pandering? What was it?
Well, it was. When you look at it realistically, it's sex between consenting adults.
Right.
And I did get sentenced to that much time. And, prison's very difficult because every day is essentially the same. And survival's the name of the game. But the prison industrial complex, it reduces you to a state that's less than human. And I certainly did feel less than human while I was imprisoned. And the government strips you of your possessions, your status in society, and it reduces you to a number, and you're provided with 3 hots and a cot. And most of the inmates were aware of my status as a DC madam because of the newspaper reportage on me. And the inmate population didn't overtly embrace homosexuals. I was initially treated like an extraterrestrial or an alien by many of the inmates, and I was repeatedly called a punk, which is inmate jargon for queer or faggot. So adjusting to prison life was very difficult for me. But, after the imprisonment, I returned to college, earned a master's degree in integrated marketing. And I think if the government offered inmates an education, there would be more success stories like mine.
Oh, my God. Yeah, that goes without saying. I have many prisoners. I have a client and a frequent guest, Reverend Pinkney, right now, who's in prison for 7 to 10 years on some ridiculous little forgery charges. They're charging him on some dates incorrect on a mayor's recall petition. And the guy, yes, 66 years old. So you're so correct. But now you did get out of prison, and then you were able to get your civil rights liberties restored?
Well, yes. And I think the philosopher Nietzsche is the best. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right.
And that quote is near and dear to my heart because I've endured a number of tragedies in my life, but I was determined not to let them destroy me. And in fact, they've galvanized my will and spurred me to reach for success. But Nietzsche should have said, what doesn't kill you often hurts like hell.
Yeah.
But I think living a good life is the best revenge, and I've managed to forge a wonderful life for myself despite repeated persecution by the government and the media.
Well, now, I talked to Nick about this, and I says, listen, when he was a young man, why did he do this? What he did? He says, well, he was young. He was, you'd think you're kind of bulletproof when you're a kid, 26 years old. You're making $20,000 a month. Who's going to argue with you, right? But now, today, why would you come out now and risk again further government persecution in this? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Sure, I do, and I have 2 objectives for telling my story. First, I want to tell my side of the story because it's never been told, and I've been subjected to a 25-year campaign of character assassination by the media. It's been relentless. And second, I believe that the American political system has become a wayward aberration of the ideas it was built upon. And I believe that blackmail has played an integral role in hijacking our political system. And those are the 2 reasons that I wanted to write the book. Because when you look in the current events, when you read the newspaper, every time you pick up something, you're hearing about it. But they don't really go into depth because the majority of the media, 90% of the media, is controlled by 5 major corporations. So I just wanted to tell my side of the story and get my side out.
Now, since the book is just barely out, Confessions of a DC Madam by Henry Vinson and Nick Bryan. By the way, Nick Bryan's the author of The Franklin Scandal, which is another. By the way, do you have a little bit more time? I'd like to get into your connections with Larry King. Lawrence King, and the whole Franklin scandal, and what you knew about that, if you have some more time.
Oh, I have. Sure, I'm fine.
Okay, great. Good. Let me take a little commercial break. We'll be back with Henry Vinson, the author of Confessions of a DC Madam. His co-author is Nick Bryan, who wrote The Franklin Scandal. And I should have jumped right on it when Henry first mentioned that he met Lawrence King, who has a whole background with this Franklin scandal. So we'll hear what Henry has to say about that right after these messages. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I am your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Today we're doing a special pre-recorded broadcast with Henry Vinson, the author of Confessions of a DC Madam. His blog is blog.confessionsof.dcmadam.com. I'll have a link to that on the Opperman Report blog as well as a link to his book and also Nick Bryan's book too about the Franklin scandal. So back to this case here, the DC Madam case. Now that the book's come out, have you gotten any threats or any kind of harassment, any kind of things you're worried about?
No, I keep a very low profile. I don't I'm not really that accessible. So no, I haven't heard anything yet. It's only been out for very few days.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to keep you in our prayers on that, okay? Now, I'm assuming you got in touch with Nick Bryant originally because of his work with the Franklin scandal, with you knowing Lawrence King. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Lawrence King was a close friend of Craig Spence, and he would often be at the parties that Craig would have. And I didn't know Lawrence King all that well, but I did see him quite a few times at Craig's place. But Larry was from Nebraska, I believe, and he was in the banking industry in some way, and he was very politically connected. But he had an inclination to like children. And the stories that Craig and Larry would tell, I really didn't believe. I thought they were so off the wall, but now it's obvious a lot of that was true.
Well, give us an idea, like about abducting children, because there is a lot of allegations that they were abducting children.
Craig, and that's right. That's what they would talk about, that they had children that they would pick up, that they would go to an orphanage. Right. They would tell these stories of bringing children back to Washington, D.C. And again, I'm from a small town in West Virginia, and I really thought it was just the drugs talking because Craig did do lots of drugs and more as in the later part of his life.
Right. When people are taking drugs, especially if they're all involved in a criminal activity, they like to brag and boast and come off as looking real tough and dangerous. So you kind of take everything with a grain of salt. That you hear in these kind of discussions with people. And at the time, there was no arrest or conviction of Lawrence King. No one knew anything about his real activity. What about that group that I believe had connections to Washington, D.C., the Finders? Are you familiar with that?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. That was the same kind of situation, too. They had CIA connections. And it was a group of little kids in Florida. I think it was Tallahassee. They were at a park with some men in suits, a bunch of dirty little kids, all disheveled. And the police came and investigated, said, hey, what's going on? And I said, oh, yeah, we're taking them to a school overseas. These are gifted kids. And it was connected to a group called the Finders that had CIA connections up there in D.C. as well, right around the same time. Okay. Now, what about, there's a lot of allegations in the Franklin scandal that Hunter S. Thompson was possibly involved as a photographer in this. Did you ever hear his name come up in any of this?
Oh, I heard his name, and he was again at. Yes, he was a photographer for the White House, I believe. Craig Spence had parties that would be like who's who. Everybody would be there. There would be media people. There would be people from the Bush administration, the Reagan administration. Craig was a mover and a shaker. He had anybody who was somebody would be at his parties. Even a former U.S. attorney was there and his wife. So lots of people were there. There certainly was no reason to think that anything was going on that wasn't okay because, again, a U.S. attorney was there.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you must have thought you had no problems with this, when you saw all these kind of people. What about like celebrities and media people? Any names you could mention? People that we would recognize today?
Well, I did see Ted Koppel at Craig's place. He was a close friend of Craig.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
Huh? Do you think that he was bisexual or gay as well?
Well, I don't want to speculate on that. I really don't know, but he was very close to Craig.
Interesting. And oh my goodness. Okay, wow. Okay, well, anybody else you can name? You can think of off the top of your head.
Well, I don't want to tell everything that's in the book.
Oh, okay. So there's more in the book then.
Oh, there's lots more in the book.
Okay, and the name of the book is Confessions of a D.C. Madam. We have the actual D.C. Madam here on the show, Henry Vinson. A fascinating guy. What a life, man. I tell you, what a life. So is there anything you want to leave us with before we go?
Well, I really appreciate you having me. I really like your show, and and I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. Any book signings coming up or anything you want to promote?
No, nothing right now. This is all fairly new to me, and I'm just trying to get the book out there a little bit.
I got you. Okay, Confessions of a DC Madam. It's available on Amazon.com. It's available on a link on my blog, The Opperman Report. You can get it at blog.confessionsofadcmadam.com, which is Henry Vinson's blog. And also, too, I believe it's on franklin.scandal.com, good old Nick Bryant's website. Henry, thank you very much. Okay, anything comes up, anything you want to update us with, or anything new events, okay, then give us a call. We'll put you right on.
Okay, I'll be in touch. Thanks again.
Have a good day, my friend.
Bye.